This video is going to cover Module 6, Homework 3, Solving Quadratics by Square Root Method. So by the square root property, it tells us if b is a real number, we have a squared equals b. So very similar to the last section, we need to get rid of that square to get a by itself. The opposite of squared is square root. So if we take the square root of both sides, that square and square root will cancel each other out. We are left with a equals, big deal here, plus or minus b. Plus or minus the square root of b. So we have that plus or minus when we take the square root. So let me show you why. Let's use this first example. Use the square root property to solve. X squared equals 16. So getting x by itself, we need to get rid of that square. The opposite of square is square root, so we can square root both sides, so that way they cancel each other out. We're left with x equals plus or minus the square root of 16 is 4. So if we go plug that back in to check, the reason why we have to do plus or minus is positive 4 squared is 16, as well as negative 4 squared, negative 4 times negative 4 also equals 16. So either one of those solutions will work. So whenever we take the square root, we have to have that plus or minus component. Same thing for the next example. Use the square root property to solve. X plus 6 squared equals 25. So the opposite of square is square root. So that way the square and the square root cancel each other out. We're left over with x plus 6 equals the square root of 25. We know we took the square root, so it's going to be plus or minus. The square root of 25 is 5. Getting x by itself, we're going to subtract 6 from both sides. So this will give us x equals negative 6 plus or minus 5. So now, negative 6 and 5 are like terms. So we have to go ahead and combine like terms. So we have negative 6 plus 5. We have negative 6 minus 5. Negative 6 plus 5 will give us negative 1 as one answer. Negative 6 minus 5 will give us negative 11 as our second answer. So those are both of our answers. In my math lab, we would do negative 1, comma, negative 11. Same thing for the next example. It says use the square root property to solve. X squared plus 196 equals 0. Working from the outside in, we need to get rid of this 196. So let's subtract 196 from both terms. And we're left with x squared equals negative 196. Now, getting rid of that square, the opposite of square is square root. So those will cancel each other out. We're left with x equals. We took the square root, so we know it's going to be plus or minus. The square root of 196 is 14, because 14 times 14 is 196. The square root of negative 1 is going to be I. So plus or minus 14i will be that answer. So over here, remember, whenever we have the square root of negative 196, we have negative 1 times 196. 196 is 14 times 14. So underneath the radical, we have negative 1 times 14 times 14. The square root of negative 1 is I, and those two 14s are coming out. So 14i will be that answer. We took the square root, so we know it's going to be plus or minus. Next example. Use the square root property to solve. We have 7x minus 5 squared equals negative 9. So first thing, getting rid of that square, we're going to take the square root of both sides, so that way the square and the square root cancel each other out. We're left with 7x minus 5 equals, we took the square root, so we know it's going to be plus or minus. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of that negative is going to be I. So plus or minus 3i. Getting x by itself, we are going to add 5 to both sides. So 7x equals 5 plus or minus 3i. Remember, in standard form, it's usually a plus bi, so that I term is going to come second. These are not like terms, we cannot combine them. Lastly, dividing both sides by 7, we get x equals 5 plus or minus 3i all over 7. None of these are like terms, we cannot simplify, so that's going to be our final answer. Last example for this note, to use the square root property to solve. x plus 8 squared plus 32 equals 0. So the first thing working from the outside in is we want to get rid of this 32. So we're going to subtract 32 from both sides. So we have x plus 8 squared equals negative 32. Getting rid of that squared, we're going to square root both sides. So we are left with x plus 8. We took the square root, so we know it's going to be plus or minus. Excuse me. Simplifying the square root of negative 32. We know it's negative 1 times 32. We'll come back to this negative 1 in a second. 32 we know is 2 times 16. 2 is done, so it gets circled. 16 is 2 times 8. 2 is done, so it gets circled. 8 is 2 and 4. 4 is 2 and 2. So underneath the radical, we have negative 1 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 2's. So the square root of negative 1 we know is I. It's the square root, so we're looking for 2 of a kind. So those 2 2's are coming out of the radical. These 2 2's are coming out of the radical. And that 1 2 is staying underneath. So we have 2 times 2, which is 4i square root of 2. So plus or minus 4i square root of 2. Lastly, getting x by itself, we're going to subtract 8 from both sides. So we're left over with our final answer of x equals negative 8 plus or minus 4i square roots of 2. These are not like terms. We cannot combine them. So this is going to be our final answer. So this is Module 6, Homework 3 notes.